Welcome, everyone, to this session titled Planning for Tomorrow, Introducing Green Project Management, to be presented by Michael Pace. This session is hosted by the Project Management Association of Canada and sponsored by IPMA USA, Procept Associates, and Title Shift. You will see the links to our sponsors' websites posted in the chat. During this live presentation, please feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A window. After the formal portion of the presentation, we will read out your questions for the speaker to answer. This presentation is also being recorded and will be posted later on YouTube for those who could not attend today. Now let's get started. Momentarily, I'm going to turn things over to Michael Pace. Michael Pace is a highly accomplished project management professional, consultant, and trainer with over 20 years of experience in building and leading high performance teams, developing and implementing effective project management processes, and driving organizational change initiatives. He is the president emeritus of IPMA USA and is closely connected within the project sustainability world. And take it away, Michael.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate that. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Talk a little bit about what we call sustainable project management. So a little bit about me. Robin gave me a pretty good introduction there. Here is my Stoic headshot and a link to my LinkedIn profile. And I'm happy to connect with you. I appreciate Kevin and PMAC for inviting me to join you today. Like Robin said, I've got about 20 plus years of experience in project program portfolio management. I've got a couple of different hats that I wear. I'm the director of academic practice for GPM Global, the director of project management at Texas A&M University's Division of Marketing and Communications. I'm the founder and principal of Diverging Roads, a consulting group, chair and convener of the board of directors of Gaia Education, an adjunct faculty member, and we can add more to that as we need. Today, I'm representing GPM, which is a social enterprise that advocates for change within the project management world. To be honest, I didn't come up with the title for today's presentation. We're not really going to introduce green project management since that's been around for a while. If you look at GPM as an organization, it's been around since 2009. We're celebrating our 15th year. The idea of green and being green has been around for a little bit, but perhaps sustainable project management isn't as mainstream as it needs to be just yet. A slight bit more about GPM before we jump into science and stuff like that. GPM is about 15 years old, as I said. It makes us a teenager. Like most teenagers, we have a tendency to be loud and a little bit obnoxious. But given some of the challenges we're facing, maybe that's what we need right now. We're a global leader in sustainable project management practices. We have been instrumental in shaping sustainability as it relates to portfolio program project management on a global scale. We offer multiple different solutions via training, certification, methods, standards, et cetera, et cetera. Some of our partners include PMI and APM over in the UK. We just announced a partnership there with IMA, the Association of Accountants and Financial Professionals in Business. We've got a couple of different resources and resources types in case anyone is interested. We have free standards, we have free research, we have white papers, we have case studies, because our goal is honestly to give everyone tools and resources to be more sustainable. We just released our newest edition of our handbook on sustainable project management as well. So what are we going to be talking about today? I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainable project management, what that is, some of the trends in sustainable project management, and really what we can do right now. And then at the end, we'll have time for a Q&A. Now, that's not necessarily a strict sequential list of things. I'll probably mix these up a little bit. But if there's only one thing you hear today, I think that it's really important to say that it's not a lack of information about when we say sustainable project management. We have plenty of information. We probably actually have too much information. So how do we make sense of all the information we have? How do we turn that into an actionable plan to help? I've been to Africa a few times. I've ridden an elephant, learned that hippos can be scared of elephants. So there's some interesting stories about elephants that apply to this idea of sustainability. There's a parable of the blind man and the elephant. It dates back to a Buddhist text from around 500 BC. And it goes something along the lines of six blind men are brought to examine an elephant that's come to their village. The first man touches the trunk and says that the elephant is like a thick snake. The second man touches the tusk and says that the elephant is like a spear. The third man touches the ear, says that the elephant is like a fan. The fourth man touches the leg, says it's like a tree. The fifth man touches the side, the belly of the elephant, says it's like a wall. The sixth man touches the tail and says the elephant is like a rope. Each of the blind men is convinced that he is right and that everyone else is wrong. Now, many, many years later, American poet John Godfrey Sachs um, told a story of that, or a version of that story, and he concluded with a simple, beautiful line that each man was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. Now, I can combine that with a statement that is purported to be from Bishop Desmond Tutu. Um, Supposedly, Bishop Tutu once asked, "How does one go about eating an elephant?" And after a pause, he answered his own question and said, "You eat it one bite at a time." So when we look at this idea of sustainable project management, both of these anecdotes apply. It might look different to everyone, and we need to eat it one bite at a time. Now, as we look at project management, it's not a new concept. The idea of needing knowledge and a certain level of depth of knowledge is critical to our success. Now, the traditional way conventional model is called an I-shaped learner, where you know an intense amount of expertise in one specific area. As you grow, you might actually develop a little bit of knowledge across multiple sectors, a little bit of knowledge about many, many things, but still maintaining that depth of expertise in that one subject. Project managers tend to develop expertise in multiple sectors. That's called a pie-shaped learner. Can evolve into what's called a comb-shaped learner, and so on and so forth. And the idea being the I-shaped learner is an expert in one area, that T and is an expert in one area, but knowledge of other areas. Pie and comb are expert in many areas with knowledge and even more. And that is kind of the underlying problem for sustainable project management. You do have to be an expert in many areas, and you have to have knowledge in even more. So I'm going to give you a very specific example. This infographic comes from 8billion trees.com, and it's the idea of the clothing industry and the amount of waste that the clothing industry produces. So based on when this infographic was created, 2.6% of global water is used to produce cotton. 700 gallons of clean water is used to produce a single cotton shirt. 68 pounds is the average weight of clothes an American discards per year. All of these pieces of information. So if you're working on a project that ends up producing clothing, 99% of used clothing is recyclable, but 4% of our landfills around the world are filled with clothing and other textiles. In the Atacama Desert down in Chile, I'll let you Google that as you listen. There are tons and tons, actually mountains now, of discarded textiles that were cheaper to send over to Chile and to dump in the desert than to recycle, to redo, to used in some other way. So we have to be cognizant of multiple different areas. Supposedly, the amount of water it takes to, and in this example was a single cotton t-shirt. And another example, we could talk about blue jeans. Everyone wears denim and wears blue jeans. And supposedly you have enough water used to produce one pair of blue jeans to support thousands of people in their daily water needs. I'm going to combine all of this information with the idea that our brain is not really good at making sense of information. From a memory perspective, from a context perspective, we struggle sometimes. Um, our brain, sadly to say, is lazy. We try to make decisions as efficiently as possible. Sometimes we fill in the blanks. This is called the Cognitive Bias Codex. Now, that's slightly dated from 2016, but what this shows are almost 300 different cognitive biases that humans could suffer with, and it has it broken down in a couple of different ways. This quadrant says that we have problems figuring out what we should remember. So we see things like the recency effect. When the silly example is that when someone gives their 2 weeks notice at their job, they try to be on their best behavior, hoping that you remember the more recent events and not necessarily all the mistakes that they did over a course of time. We also struggle with what do we do with having way too much information? So we notice when something has been changed, but maybe not when we see the same things over and over again. We are drawn to details that confirm our existing beliefs. Things like confirmation bias are incredibly dangerous in the academic setting, but anchoring bias is something we all make use of in a negotiation, on the idea that if you go first in a negotiation, you create that anchor um, to help provide that firm foundation from which other things are built from. We also struggle with having not enough meaning behind the information that we get. So you'll see lots of different biases listed there. And I encourage you to take a few minutes when you're bored at work and pretending to actually work. Things like the placebo effect fall into this category. The idea that you might feel better just taking a sugar pill because you've been paid attention to with the placebo. There was a study in the early aughts, early 1900s, where when we got into management as a science, a group of scientists were studying a group of workers. And what they were looking at is, do the workers work better in no lighting conditions? Do they work better with the lights turned on? Do they work better when you turn on the lights halfway through the day? And what they found was just paying attention to people is what mattered. So there's things like that. We also see things like Murphy's Law, the idea that the worst thing that can happen does happen. The last quadrant in this idea of bias and cognitive biases that we suffer from are this need to act fast. So we have ideas about like the sunk cost fallacy. We will continue to throw in money because we've spent so much time on a project already that we don't want to pull it back. So all that to say that we have all this information, and sometimes we don't have enough information available to us to make sense of it and to act, and that's problematic as we look at this idea of sustainable project management. So one more little hurdle to get into before the nitty-gritty of sustainable project management. It's not a new thing. Um, as we look at waves over time, sustainability in project management has steadily been growing since about the 1970s. 1970s is where it kicks off. We saw a green movement in the 80s through the 90s. We saw focuses on globalization into sustainability in the early aughts and tens. Climate action, ESG became a big factor in around 2015, 2020. And now what we're trying to focus on is this idea of regeneration. What we'll talk about here in a minute are the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. And that's around the 2010 mark. If you're looking at GPM and what we're doing, that fits pretty firmly in the regeneration phase. Now, when it's easy to have a graphic with little waves and pictures, but to put some data, 1972 is the Stockholm Declaration, the first major international global conference on environmental issues. And we've been building steadily since then. 87 was the Brundtland Report, 97 was the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement in 2015, all building towards how can we, as a global society, be more sustainable. So where does that leave us today? The pretty standard focus now are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They came out early 2010s, right around there, and they're honestly tied to the United Nations Agenda 2030. And it's a pretty big, fat, hairy, audacious goal of how can we on a global scale be more sustainable. Now, if you're not familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, you might um, see some of the icons listed here on the UN's from the UN site that are surprising to you. Number one, in fact, is no poverty. Number two is no hunger. Number three is good health. We see good jobs, economic growth. We see reduced inequality. Climate action is absolutely there. Respect for life, and how do we keep being more sustainable with life below water, on land. Perhaps the most important of these goals is number 17, in fact. It's the idea we can't do anything by ourselves. We do have to act on a global scale with partners and alliances and work together. Now, personally, my favorite is number 4, the idea of equality education. Education is a huge factor as we look at sustainability. Um, if you don't know what you don't know, it's hard to do better. The problem, though, well, one problem is that we fairly globally tend to focus on responsible consumption. When people say sustainable, most often we jump straight to I'm going to recycle, or they think plastics, or they think throwing away, reduce, recycle, that kind of thing. And that does get slightly problematic. As we see it's more complicated than that. Each year, we use about 1.7 Earth's worth of resources. Said a slightly different way, Earth Overshoot Day marks the date each year that humanity has used up all the resources that our planet can regenerate in that 1 year time span. So imagine your project has a budget and it's supposed to last, that budget needs to last 12 full months, and you spend it all in 8 months. That's what Earth Overshoot Day represents on this global scale. We're overspending our natural resource budget. So every year, Earth Overshoot Day comes earlier and earlier, and it's indicating that we're using resources faster than the planet can replenish them. So our projects, it doesn't matter if they're construction projects, manufacturing, technology, healthcare. Um, our projects play a big part in this because projects are an agent of change. Projects create products. We're built into the system here. So when we build new infrastructure, we produce goods, we develop new technologies. We often consume resources like energy, like water, raw materials. We consume those resources at a rate that's unsustainable. Each country has its own day, and the more industrialized countries tend to be closer towards January, and that again is moving up each and every year. In the United States, for example, 20 years ago, 2004, Earth Overshoot Day for the US was around September 2nd. More recent data puts Earth Overshoot Day for the US in the middle of March. And it's just a measure here of how fast the rate of human consumption has increased, and that our demand for finite resources has grown. I don't expect you to take my word for it. So this is from the Earth Overshoot, earthovershootday.org, and their information. You'll see kind of on the top right-hand side, United States of America listed of March 14. Now, I like my northern neighbors, but you'll see Canada listed right below that of March 15th. So when I talk to a diverse group of folks, we like to usually point out the different countries that people come from. Um, Different countries overshoot resources at a different rate. So, for example, the nation of Qatar or Qatar, depending on how you want to say that, is around February 11th there. And that means if the entire population of Earth lived the same way as the average person in Qatar, we would use all of the Earth's resources by February 11th. If we all live like the Belgians, it would be March 23rd. The Colombians, it would be October 5th. The United Kingdom is June 3rd. If we all live like Indonesia, it'd be closer to there, November 24th. Let's combine that with the idea that by 2030, 57% of the global GDP will be project work, roughly 54.5 trillion euros. 25 million new project professionals are purported to be needed by 2030. Now, we have this idea of projects as an agent of change. We also have this idea that the vast majority or 50% of global GDP will be project based. We have new project professionals coming in. If we infuse sustainable methods into project work, we could do some really cool things. We could solve some major world problems. Now, we do have to understand where we're starting from. Climate impact has a huge climate impacts our projects. Climate change has a major impact. If we look at the data from June to December of 2023, we're setting new temperature records fairly frequently now. There were 7 major events throughout 2023 that highlighted significant infrastructure vulnerabilities. We could look at Asia's record-breaking heat. All outdoor work in Beijing was halted for, I think it was 27 days because the streak of temperatures in Beijing were above 35 degrees C. Libya had catastrophic flooding last year. Cyclone Freddy impacted Southeast Asia, lasted for more than 5 weeks, killed almost 1,500 people, and it displaced nearly 2 million. Australia had spring heat waves. The temperatures were 12 degrees C above average, and it resulted in some disruption of their natural weather cycle. Heat and wildfires throughout Europe and throughout the US. Chile set record heat and had wildfires. And what we see is these impacts of climate change are also creating a pretty big disruption on our projects. Um, doesn't really matter what industry we look at either. So obviously hospitality and tourism will have the biggest impact. But regardless of the sector we work in, we're seeing major impacts from climate change on our projects. We've been studying this for a few years now. Our latest study in 2024 showed an increase. 2021 data, about 38% of projects were impacted by climate change. That's up to 53% in the last study that we did this year. One more science thing to throw at you. We look at things like the planetary boundaries. There are 9 planetary boundaries that are fairly important to understand when we talk about climate change, when we talk about sustainability. These boundaries help keep our environment stable, and they include things like climate change, where too much pollution warms the earth. But it also includes things like biodiversity loss, where many species are at a risk of disappearing altogether. Our projects, such as construction or energy, can impact these boundaries by using renewable energy, conserving water, protecting wildlife habitats. We can help keep our planet healthy. Since 2015, we have crossed the 9 planetary boundaries, and you'll see the data that's listed there on the screen. So as you can see, biodiversity loss, novel entities such as plastics, synthetic chemicals, pesticides, genetically modified organisms, phosphorus, nitrogen. We are passing the safe operating space of these boundaries. and are at an alarming rate. And that's problematic. And again, if we go back to the idea that when we talk sustainability, we mainly talk about recycling. That's not enough. Conventional thinking, this idea about just recycling, what we see is the resource consumption exceeds those planetary boundaries. Sustainability, however, is this balancing act where the phrase do no harm comes up over and over again. Our goal ultimately is to aim toward regenerative, where we're repairing some of the damage that's already been done. Those UN SDGs sit right in the middle. We want to have this balancing act. Now, when I teach and I consult on sustainable project management, what I explain isn't what most people think. So, sustainability, which you see here in the middle, is nothing more than treading water. It means do no harm. On the left side, we have been business as usual. It's the idea of take, make, waste. And that's what got us here. This green movement is incrementally better, but it only focuses on things like being eco-friendly. It stabilizes the patient, but it doesn't repair the damage that's already been done. And so what we need to do as a profession is move toward the right, restorative and regenerative. Um, we must regenerate both what's been depleted and what we are currently taking, and then work to sustain a regenerated state, which continues to practice this idea of regeneration. That's regenerative sustainability. So again, I'll put the SDGs right there in the middle. It's just enough to stop the bleeding now. And if you ask why, well, it's because they don't really address the root cause. It is great to have end poverty as a goal, but we don't talk about why poverty exists in the first place. Now, our profession has our finger on the button of change. Um, it really is our moral obligation to solve these problems by eliminating the reason they exist in the first place. And I believe we can. Here's your standard slide where we start talking about project management starts way back when. It's not a new concept. You can't have a talk about project management and not talk about the Great Pyramids of Giza. We can argue later about aliens or not. An interesting thing to think about though is in 1500, Sir Thomas More wrote that projects could be a way of solving societal challenges. That was in his book Utopia, which is interesting because throughout the 1900s, a lot of the tools that we invented, that we use, that we develop throughout the 1900s were designed for projects to be incredibly efficient and effective at killing people. It doesn't matter if you're looking at PERT or the United Navy and the Polaris submarine, the Gantt chart, World War I or II military projects, the work breakdown structure, et cetera, et cetera. We spent the better part of 100 years developing tools to be highly effective of killing people. Now, technically, the Agile Manifesto has nothing to do with that, but 2001, we have the Agile Manifesto with this kind of jumping point off from what we were talking about. 2011, we introduced PRISM and the P5 standard to really focus on sustainable project management. And what's the difference? We all know about the iron triangle, scope, schedule, and budget. I think it's interesting that once you create an icon like a triangle, as you add more elements, you can't change it from the iron triangle to the iron square. So quality goes in the middle, or risks, or resources. Doesn't matter what you put in the middle of the triangle. That idea is based on compliance. How can we make sure that we stay within the constraints of our project? What comes next is this idea of projects should create value. They need to consider things like scope, schedule, budget. They need to consider things like risks, the benefits of the project. Are we delivering value? But as we do that, we need to look at people, planet, and prosperity, what Elkington introduced as the triple bottom line. And we needed to look at it from the process perspective as well as the product that we are creating. Um, So we'll continue this idea of scope, schedule, and budget, and that's really important, but it's just not enough. We need to look at things through a different lens. Now, when we talk about sustainable project management, I don't think it's that people don't want to help or change. I think the central message is, what do you do with all this information? So I've spent about 10 minutes just wasting a lot of time on Google, and I found countless examples of ideas of how to solve a problem. Information is Beautiful is a kind of neat site. So this one, food waste, it examines food waste and the idea that global hunger is a problem not because we don't produce enough food, we just don't get it into the right places or to the right people's hands. So, this set of data looks at the idea of food waste and what we can do and has lots of great ideas about how we could do it. But again, it's a lot of information. Um, we can look at it from the perspective of net zero carbon and how do we reduce emissions? How can we decarbonize? We could talk about carbon sequestration. We could talk about plastics and the plastics crisis. There's an irony of there was a recent study where a ship, an academic ship, went down to Antarctica to study microplastics in the ocean. And what they found near Antarctica were increased amounts of microplastics in the ocean. And they started looking at it, and what they found was their own boat was leaching paint. The paint had microplastics, so they were actually creating the pollution they were trying to study. We could talk about how you're using plastics in your daily life and the idea of rethinking how you do that. The idea of if you're using a plastic bottle versus a reusable water bottle. Um, we could talk about emissions. We could talk about the water crises and how water is used and how much water we have. Again, it's not that there's not enough information. The problem with sustainable project management is that all of that information creates this really confusing perspective of what do you focus on? What are you supposed to do with all this information? So GPM recommends from this value creation perspective, what we created was called the P5 standard. The P5 standard looks at it from 5 lenses. It looks at the lifespan of the product as well as how that product is serviced. What we want to see is a product that is produced by the project that lasts a very long time and that is able to be serviced in a circular way. We also want to look at the project itself, the efficiency, effectiveness of that project, as well as the fairness of those processes. I think we've all, when we sat down for the PMP or various certification exams, there's always that question of you're working on a project in a foreign country and it is customary to bribe the official. What do you do? There's an element of fairness that has to be considered as we expand our perspective of what sustainability really looks like and really includes. So we look at it from, again, those 5 perspectives. We have 4 social categories we like to look at. We like to look at labor practices and decent work. The idea about unions in the United States is kind of verboten, but what are fair labor practices? How are we developing local competencies? How are we using local staff and local labor? Society and customers, are we looking at customer health and safety? Are we protecting indigenous and tribal peoples? Human rights, ethical behavior round out the categories there. We have 4 environmental categories, things like transport of how are the logistics of getting supplies to and from our project site handled? What is water consumption going to look like on our project or throughout the servicing of our product? What's the wildlife habitat look like as we look at energy, land, air, water, and consumption? And then we have 3 economic categories. I think we'd all agree we like money. Money enables us to do lots of cool things. My kids like eating and like having a house, so it's never about just looking at one of these categories, it's all about balance. So we look and say, is there a financial analysis that's been done? Is there resiliency of the project, of the product? Are we looking at direct and indirect benefits? Things like ESG and ESG disclosures and double materiality become integral in this idea as investors want to know that their money is going into the right place. It all told 49 different elements, 245 ways to assess the sustainability in a project. And again, the problem isn't that there's not enough information, it's how do we attach it or attack it in a logical, organized way. So if I look for just a minute here at one single element, we could look at biological diversity, which falls under land, air, and water. Our standard says things like, the definition of it so that we're all on the same page. We look for guidance on the project team. Um, have you identified and complied with relevant laws? Have you looked at net positive impact? Have you sought out opportunities to collaborate with the local communities? Provide guidance on benefits that would be realized when the standard is adhered to. And for each of those elements is direct linkage to the SDG goals and targets from the UN. If you're really looking for all the details, we've got things like the project team should, and providing that framework. And again, the idea is simply how do you look at things from a different perspective, both from a project perspective and the product itself. As we look at these ideas, what we do is called a P5 impact analysis. It's an orderly fashion. We understand the project's context. We start looking to identify the actual and potential impacts from product and process perspectives, those major lenses. We do some scoring on the severity and propose a remediation response. If we were to consider an analogy, it would be analogous to a risk register. We assign a score based on a proposed remediation response. We have a sustainability management plan that we look at from those impacts, and we assign work to the action owners. We start remediating different impacts. And then ultimately, we provide impacts, actions taken, outcomes for sustainability reports, ESG disclosures. The idea that this orderly fashion approach to looking at sustainability. Now, the problem is my preferred mechanism of thinking about things like this is called a complex adaptive system. I'm not going to explain the crazy diagram on the left, but I am going to say it's not a straightforward path. All of this is a path of experimenting, learning, pivoting. We could say that it's agile, but I think as project management professionals, we would probably twinge a little bit at saying agile. We'll say nimble and flexible. We need to have that sustainable culture as a foundation. We need to have leadership that encourages us to grow in our sustainability. We need to have processes that are sustainable. And we need to focus on how we're going to deliver value. And a broad definition of who our stakeholders are. Now, we are not prescriptive when you look at sustainable project management. We've tried to grow partnerships and alliances to provide as many tools as possible. So, for example, we've partnered with we created the sustainability principles for PMOs in partnership with, and the name is going to escape me because it's late in the afternoon. I apologize. But the idea of not just a project management process, but how can you embed these principles into your project management office? We partnered with the Agile Business Consortium on how can we be sustainably agile. And the QR codes you see here on the sign link directly to the download of how you could do that. We're working with folks on how to be a regenerative leader and how to practice regenerative leadership. We're working to help folks from an ESG perspective, from an investing perspective. How do we make sense of that? And honestly, the core thing is focusing small picture what you can do, and it goes back to how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time, but you do start with what you can do. And then maybe we peel that back, use another analogy of an onion and say, what can you do? What can your organization do? What can your clients, what can your community? as we grow and we grow. It's not about doom and gloom. There is a little bit of that element as we look at a baseline, but I think we'd all agree that it's fairly important to know where you're starting so that as you look to a forecast of the future, you can know which path makes the most sense, what resources you're dealing with. If you don't know your starting point, it's really hard to figure out where you're going next. Some folks say just we have to do more. I don't think that's good enough. I think we'd all agree we really can do more. I appreciate y'all's time today. Again, happy to connect with you on LinkedIn and share more information with you. I think we have multiple minutes now for a Q&A session. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Robin to help. If you have any questions, I am happy to answer as best I can. Thank you.
Okay, wow. Thank you, Michael, for that amazing presentation. Now we can go to some questions. I'm reminding audience members to type your questions into the Q&A window, and I will read them out for Michael to answer. So far, we have one question from Carol. How can we reconcile real green change with the advent of AI energy use in PM?
Hi, Carol. Thanks for the question. That's a depending on how you interpret it, that we could take that a couple of different ways. So I'm going to answer probably way too long, and you tell me if I hit the mark. You say real green, and that is a huge problem across the board. The phrasing we like to say is greenwashing. Greenwashing is a huge problem. But the idea that people say they're sustainable and they're really not. I don't have a good answer. If we had a good answer, it wouldn't really be a problem anymore. When you say AI energy use, that again is a huge problem, and it comes from awareness, I believe. The idea of Google or Facebook or Meta, the huge amount of energy that is used to do things like AI. I'm not an expert on the AI energy use. I recently did some work and we did Bitcoin energy use. So in the state of Texas, over by me, um, the Bitcoin farm that is in Texas supposedly uses more energy than everyone else in the state combined. Now, don't quote me on that, but it's a close to that amount of energy being used. And I would argue it comes down again to awareness. Being aware of where the energy is coming from, how much you're going to use, can you offset it? And so we talk about things like carbon offsets. We talk about can you purchase credits? Um, it can be daunting at first, but like any other project, factoring it into your plan, determining where the information comes from and where the information flows, is it accurate information? All play some critical roles in that challenge. Let me know if I hit that where you were going with that.
Thank you, Michael. And Carol said, yes, helpful. Do we have any other questions for Michael? Now's your chance to pop them into the Q&A window. No more questions?
Robin, I think that means I did such a great job explaining concepts.
I agree.
So
Yep.
I'll take it as a win.
Excellent. Okay, amazing. Thank you, Michael.